Hey, good evening, brethren. Good to have you with us again. I'm hoping that everybody can hear me okay. Now, somebody have to tell me. We're going to continue our series of lessons tonight on corroborating the Bible. So we're looking at archaeology, history, and the Holy Scriptures and tying them all together to see how everything works together. We're going to continue tonight with the last of the stories that we're going to look at from the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. And that's the Tower of Babel. We'll look tonight at chapter 11. Which is another so-called myth from the first 11 chapters of Genesis. It ends our discussion of these difficult passages that defy modern scientific research. We have been looking at the fact that the first 11 chapters are the most disputed in all the Bible because they deal so much with supernatural things that cannot be proven by science. Tower of Babel and the dividing of the languages on earth is one of the most denounced and tested of all of the accounts in these chapters. It's found in chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. We'll look at that just now. Now, all the earth used the same language. Now, all the earth used the same language and the same words, and it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." They used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, a tower whose top will reach into heaven. Let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the earth." Now the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the men had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they have started to do, and now nothing which they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there to over the face of all the earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore it was named Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad across the face of the earth. As we look at this text, there's several things that the Bible does not say here, and it's typical of many of the stories that we find in the Old Testament, especially in the books of Genesis. There's lots of information, but not all the information we'd like to have. For example, like most Bible narratives, in this example, the Scripture never discusses the reason why God felt like He needed to break up the group building the city. Suggests a couple of things, but never explicitly says what the reason was. It doesn't say anything about the size, the shape, or the degree of the completion of the tower when God came down to visit, or what kind of a tower it was. It doesn't name the primary movers and shakers of the project, who was involved and who was not involved, and so on. None of that is included in the text, so we have to just understand that this is a partial text, or a partial understanding of the event that was going on. There are several things that I want you to notice about this particular story. That is that it was tight and well designed, and a fascinating nature of the account that we had to look at tonight. Notice the repetition of phrases like, for example, "let us," which in verse 3, the people say, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." And then in verse 4, they say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city." And in verse 7, God says, "Come, let us go down," and they're confused with their languages. So God is sort of the counterpart of everything they're planning to do. And so as they say, "Let us make bricks and let us build ourselves a city," God says, "Let us not let that happen." Just wonderful way that the story progresses there. I also want you to notice some irony in the story. It's a very ironic story. The humans don't want to be scattered across the surface of the earth. So the Lord says, "Let us scatter them across the earth." Humans want to make a tower that reaches into the heavens, but God has to come down to even see the thing. So there's some wonderful stuff going on in this story. It's very well put together, 9 verses worth. If you look at some important wordplay, the word Babel from Hebrew means to confuse. It's also the root word of the word Babylon, or the city Babylon, and that's going to play into our story tonight as we look at the history of this. Let's look at some brief historical studies. Earliest commentators on the text thought that the issue that God had with the people was that they wanted to storm into the heavens. They wanted to build a tower that reached to the heavens so they could reach the heavens. That would be an impossibility, and God knew that. We know that as well, of course. Well, those people might not have known that, but anyways, they wanted to build a tower into the heavens. God didn't want that to happen. For example, if you look at third Baruch for chapter 3, verse 5 through 8, third Baruch is also known as the Greek apocalypse of Baruch. This suggests that the people wanted to build into the heavens so they could reach the heavens. It's part of the pseudepigrapha, which is just a lot of falsely named books that have to do with Bible stuff. So this would suggest they wanted to wage war against God, and that's not at all what was going on, I don't think. But anyway, if you want to read along, we'll look at third Baruch chapter 3, verse 5 through 8. Which begins, "And I asked the angel, I pray thee, Lord, say to me, who are these? And he said, These are they who gave the counsel to build the tower, they whom thou seest drove forth multitudes of both men and women to make bricks. among whom the woman making bricks is not allowed to be released in the hour of childbirth, but brought forth while she was making bricks, and carried her child in her apron, and continued to make bricks. And the Lord appeared to them and confused their language, their speech, when they had built the tower to the height of 463 cubits. And they took a gimlet and sought to pierce the heaven, saying, let us see whether the heaven is made of clay, or of brass, or of iron. When God saw this, he did not permit them, but smote them with blindness, confusion of speech, and rendered them as thou seest. So basically, the folks that whoever was who recorded Third Baruch thought the idea was they were trying to breach heaven, so God didn't want that to happen. Modern commentators find a different idea, and I find a different idea myself about what's going on. Most now focus on a couple of reasons for God's actions on that day. First is possibly the rebellion against God was God had commanded the earth to be filled, and they were rebelling against that. For example, in Genesis chapter 9 verse 1, just prior to our account here, the Lord blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The idea was the whole earth was to be filled, not just a part of it. So when these folks reach Shinar and they want to stay there, which Shinar is a part of Samaria, it's actually known as Sumer in other places, they decide to stay there. They show that they're rebelling against God's command to fill the earth. And also pride and arrogance in wishing to make a name for themselves in verse 4, I think may play into this. God doesn't want their pride to enable them to do things that God doesn't want them to do. These ideas, I think, are better supported by God's word than the idea that they're trying to breach heaven. Behold, they are one people, God says, and they all have the same language. And this is what they have started to do. And now nothing that they plan to do will be impossible for them. The Lord is, of course, speaking figuratively there. He knows they obviously will never be able to build a tower into heaven. That's impossible, and we all know that, and God did, of course, at that time. But they could remain united in their rebellion against him, and I think that's what God was focusing on at that time. Now, there's some primary objections to the story, and it's basically based upon the idea that this is a myth that is connected to a Babylonian tower north of the Marduk temple called Babilu, or the Gate of God. That's a real temple tower that's been found and discovered, and people have associated the story of the Bible with this particular tower. According to an article in the Sloan collection from May of 2017, the story may be a late addition based upon historical evidence found in what is now called the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babel stele. Now, stele is a chunk of rock, which you can see to the right there, the right-hand side. It's a chunk of rock that has writing on it, and you can't see the description very well at that point, but I'll show you the next slide, a drawing of what the stele would look like. The stele contains an inscription from Nebuchadnezzar, the Nebuchadnezzar from the Bible, yes, speaking of his work to complete two enormous ziggurats at the same time. Now, a ziggurat, folks, it's basically a tower that was built to give honor to the gods and to try to reach heaven. There's many of those in Samaria, and we'll look at some of that as we continue on with our study tonight. But in order for Nebuchadnezzar to finish two of these at the same time, he would have required 17 million bricks for only one of the towers, so about double that for two. The project took 43 years to complete. It just gives you an idea of how huge these ziggurats were. Nebuchadnezzar brought workers from all over the world who did not speak the same language, and therefore confusion ensued. And so folks who are going to doubt the Bible story will say that this is the result, that this is what fed the story that became the myth that's now part of the Bible. I want to show a video tonight, and I hope that it works better than the last time. I think you can hear things better, I hope, tonight than we could. This video is about 17 minutes long, but I hope you watch it anyway. It's entitled, Did the Tower of Babel Exist? And it'll answer a lot of the questions that we're going to have concerning this important tower in the Bible. Let's see if we can hear this.
The Tower of Babel is one of the most intriguing and mysterious passages in the Bible. According to the story, a group of people migrated into the land of Shinar and attempted to build a tower to make a name for themselves, until God came down and confused their languages, and then they dispersed from the city. But was this tower actually built, or was it just a myth created by later Jewish authors? When most people hear of the Tower of Babel, they think of this image, some sort of circular tower being constructed in order to reach the clouds, hundreds of meters high. But the truth is, this image came from a 16th century painter who had no knowledge of the ancient Near East. So this type of tower probably never existed. The real Tower of Babel was probably something else entirely. Genesis 11 reminds us that this event is happening in the land of Sumer, or as the Hebrews called it, Shinar. In ancient Sumer, cities were built around large religious structures called ziggurats. Ziggurats were sort of large structures with a raised platform and meant to be the highest object in the city. Many scholars believe they were meant to function as a gateway for the gods to come down to earth from the heavens. They probably were not meant for religious ceremonies, which would have been conducted in nearby temples. Instead, they were more about connecting the heavens and the earth via the stairways on the ziggurats. For example, the ziggurat at Babylon was given a title that means the foundations of heaven and earth. The one at Larsa meant temple that links heaven and earth, and the one at Sippor meant stairway to pure heaven. For ziggurat, nor were there any ziggurats built in Canaan, a large structure that a city was built around in the land of Sumer. The obvious and most likely structure in mind is an ancient Sumerian ziggurat. Thus, the Tower of Babel was probably the ziggurat of Babel. Now the next question should be, is when was this tower or ziggurat of Babel built and where? There are some interesting correlations in the text that help us to place the time period for the Tower of Babel and strengthen the reliability of the biblical account. First, it said they made bricks by burning them. In ancient Mesopotamia, fired brick technology was probably developed around the end of the 5th millennium BC. Such bricks did really not exist in Canaan because they did not need them due to the availability of stones and other building materials. In southern Mesopotamia, large stones were not as available, and so out of necessity, fired bricks were developed in order to build temples and other large structures. Thus, the Hebrew authors get the building material correct, even though it was not present in their own region. Second, Genesis 11 records the tower was supposed to have its tops in the heavens. This description matches how Mesopotamian texts speak of ziggurats. John Walton says, throughout Mesopotamian literature, almost every occurrence of the expression describing a building with its head in the heavens refers to a temple with a ziggurat. For example, here is a description by Wared Sin, king of Larsa. He made it as high as a mountain and made its head touch heaven. On account of this deed, the gods Nana and Nagal rejoiced. Third, Genesis 11 says the tower was built after people migrated from the east. Now, this could possibly be a reference to the Proto-Sumerians arriving in Mesopotamia. Some scholars think the Sumerians originated in the region, but that is unlikely. Their language is totally unlike the surrounding regional languages. Karen Ray Nimitnijat notes, Sumerian is not related to any language, living or dead. Jean Botero also notes an ancient text called the Myth of the Seven Sages, according to which the southern population, which was still rough-hewn and wild, had been initiated into all that constituted civilized life by strange beings who came by the sea. So it appears the Sumerian culture probably began after a slow migration of new people into the region. Nimitnijat thinks the Sumerian culture appeared in Mesopotamia around the end of the 4th millennium BC, which was also during the Uruk period. George Rowe suggests between 3200 BC and 3500 BC. Some scholars place the arrival of the Sumerians a little further back, but they probably at least arrived sometime after the Ubaid period, and then conquered the region and its inhabitants, bringing with them their unique and obscure language. This probably didn't happen all at once, and was probably a gradual migration, and the people that migrated in mixed with the locals to produce what we now know as ancient Sumer. But it is possible the biblical authors also allude to this migration, saying they came from the east and then took over the region. The urbanization of southern Mesopotamia also seems to have begun around this time. Now, the text of Genesis 11 seems to be talking about the beginning of this time period. That is, when people arrived from the east, shortly after the invention of fired bricks, and the beginning of urbanization. So based on the external evidence, Genesis 11 seems to be talking about an event that happened during the 4th millennium BC and not any later construction of ziggurats or cities. The time period was called the Uruk period, or the Proto-Literate period, as it was the period just before the invention of writing. However, if this is the case, then it creates a problem, as it is often assumed the Tower of Babel refers to the city of Babylon, which wasn't established until the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. But interestingly enough, other ancient texts speak of Babylon existing in ancient times before the 2nd millennium BC. The reason for this is because Babylon and the ancient city of Eridu were often equated. For example, the cities are equated by Berosus when he says the ancient king Alaros reigned in Babylon, whereas the kingless refer to this as Eridu. The toponym for Eridu was also used of Babylon. A.R. George lists several early texts that equate Eridu and Babylon and indicate the traditions of Eridu seem to have become the traditions of Babylon. In one creation myth, Ea establishes his temple Ezekiel when Eridu was built, but then the text calls the city Babylon. Thus it seems Babylon was seen as the new Eridu, and Eridu was seen as the ancient version of Babylon. So the Babel of Genesis 11 is probably a reference to Eridu, not the later New Babylon, established in the 2nd millennium BC, after the decline of Eridu had already happened. So if we're going to look for the Tower of Babel in the 4th millennium BC, Eridu is the most likely place, and the ziggurat constructed there is the most likely candidate. Now Genesis 11 says that after they built the ziggurat, God came down and confused their languages, and they left from building the city. Now Eridu was abandoned several times, and finally abandoned for good in 600 BC. One important abandonment did happen in the 4th millennium BC, after the construction of a ziggurat, referred to as Temple 1. Fuad Safar excavated Eridu and found evidence of occupations there, going back thousands of years. The oldest temple may be as old as the city itself, and over time, larger structures were built on top, expanding the size of the site. The final temple was constructed in the Uruk period, or 4th millennium BC, and referred to as Temple 1 and Temple 2. However, after this, the city was suddenly and abruptly abandoned and was never restored to its former glory. Gwendolyn Leake says, almost overnight, Eridu was completely abandoned, quickly buried under enormous drifts of sand that filled the deserted buildings, with only the main mount left standing. The temple itself was rebuilt twice in the Proto-Literate period, like an island in the desert, but the accumulation of loose sand seems to have made the area surrounding the main mount uninhabitable. When after some centuries, the area was once more inhabited, the population chose another spot, about a kilometer to the north, and few efforts were made to rebuild the shrine on the main mound. The site only became important again in the early dynastic II period. In other words, the city of Eridu was abandoned during the Uruk period, even though the cultic site was still in use after. Another archaeological survey by Henry Wright records that the later periods after the Uruk period show little evidence of occupation. It is unfortunate that the Jemdet Nasar and early dynastic III complexes are indicated primarily by the absence of things, for it is difficult to establish their presence unless they form the dominant complex on a site. Fuad Safar agrees. This was the situation at Eridu during the first half of the Uruk period, which appears to have been brought to a conclusion by no less an event than the total abandonment of the site. In other words, the archaeological data suggests Eridu was suddenly abandoned during the time period of Temple 1, and the ziggurat structure was only fully restored later during the Ur-III dynasty. The evidence shows the combinations of Temple 1 and Temple 2 created a massive structure in the center of Eridu, dedicated to the god Enki, also called Ea. Safar also notes there is evidence the structure was built with baked bricks. Then, the evidence suggests during the 4th millennium BC, or the Uruk period, Eridu was suddenly abandoned, leaving this massive ziggurat complex behind. Then what we see is that later kings, during the Ur-3rd dynasty, rebuilt over this ziggurat and added to the overall complex. Now, if you do your research, you will find that Safar notes the temple and the ziggurat complex that was at Eridu was not abandoned as long as the city was. In other words, we have evidence the ziggurat complex was utilized after the city was abandoned at various times, later in the Proto-Literate period, up until the time of the 3rd Ur dynasty, when Amarsin restored it. But this seems to be what Genesis 11 says. Genesis says they left off from building the city, not necessarily the ziggurat itself. In verse 5, Genesis notes that God came down after the ziggurat was already built, and then they were dispersed, and they stopped building the city and abandoned it. It doesn't say the Tower of Babel was never completed. In the archaeological record, for some odd reason, the city of Eridu was abandoned, even though the ziggurat complex was still in use by a small northern settlement. Then, the Ur-3rd dynasty later came in and restored the ziggurat and temple because the whole complex fell into ruin. Leek notes the city itself was only treated as a cultic site from here on out. It was never seen as a fully fledged city again. Religious and economic centers slowly were moved to other cities, like Babylon or the city of Ur. In other words, Eridu was habited, but only for religious reasons, until it was fully abandoned during the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And it was never fully restored to its former greatness, like it was in the Proto-Literate period. On top of this, even though the ziggurat complex was still in use later during the Proto-Literate period, Safar does note that the ziggurat complex did fall into ruin because it was temporarily abandoned for a shorter time when the city itself was abandoned. So basically, the evidence suggests that when the city was suddenly left abandoned during the Uruk period, the ziggurat complex itself was also abandoned temporarily, but a northern settlement began to utilize it again and repave some parts. Then, the 3rd dynasty of Ur fully restored the ziggurat complex and built on top of it. But all this seems to be a pretty strong correlation to what Genesis 11 records happened. An older city, also known as Babel, constructed a massive ziggurat from fired bricks, and then the site was suddenly abandoned and was never restored to its former glory, even though a later new city of Babel was established at a different location. Now, correlations alone do not prove the event recorded in Genesis 11 happened. However, it also cannot be presupposed the Tower of Babel was just a mythic invention meant to attack Babylon during the Jewish exile. The text of Genesis 11 is written in a way that is describing a real event in the past. It could have been used in a way to attack the later empire of Babylon, but the authors seem to be using an historical event in the past, not inventing a legend whole cloth. And given the archaeological data, it very well could have happened during the Uruk period, which the later city of Babylon claims to have descended from. So despite the critics, we do have good evidence the Tower of Babel story could have been a real historical event that took place in the Proto-Literate period. Last, what about the languages being confused? Well, this would be hard to prove archaeologically speaking, since it happened at a time before written records. Some have told me privately that because Sumerian isn't related to other languages, living or dead, it could have been a result of the languages being confused by God. Now, I guess this is possible, but as of now, I'm not willing to take this route. The text of Genesis 11 says they dispersed from the region and moved out, so each group is probably untraceable and would have blended in with whatever culture they assimilated into. The only other text that might hint to this event is the Sumerian epic called Animarchar in the Lord of Arata. Some scholars believe this text is talking about a future event when everyone will worship Enlil with one tongue. But Samuel Noah Kramer believed this text was referring to a time in the past, when all the people worshipped Enlil with one tongue, until his rival, the god Enki, came down and confused the languages. Enki was the patron deity of Eridu, which is referred to in the text. It also speaks of a Nemerkar wanting to build the massive ziggurat at Eridu, and that it will be a holy mountain and an abode for the gods. So the text does make reference to Eridu, but this is all contingent on the idea that Kramer's translation is the correct one, which we have to acknowledge is disputed. However, even without this, we still do have good evidence the event described in Genesis 11 was describing a real historical event that seems to have happened at Old Babel, or Eridu, the city of Enki. New people migrated into the area, built a large ziggurat complex that utilized fired bricks. Then the city was suddenly abandoned, and a Sumerian epic might allude to Enki confusing the languages. Thus, given the data, the Tower of Babel incident, as recorded in Genesis, correlates well with an event that happened in Mesopotamia's past.
So thank you for taking the time to watch that video with me. I hope it answered a lot of your questions about why we think that Babel is a good story in Scripture, not something that's just mythical. I think you noticed that the guy used the word possibly and probably a lot. That's because we can't prove any of this. We really cannot. All these things have a prehistory, and the only reason that we have to deal with this at all is because Moses chose to include it in writings, and we believe that the Lord gave it to him to record. So what's being supposed these days is that by those who would make this a myth, they'll say stuff like this. So when the Genesis text was composed by the Jews during the exile and after return to their homeland, they interpreted this down-to-earth story as of construction chaos in a theological context. As dictated by the traditions of the time, Yahweh had to be invoked. Thus, the present text in Genesis had to be written that way. All right, so their idea is that when the people of God were in Babylon, they heard these stories and they put them together and they said, hey, let's write this about us. And they made it a myth that would go back to the beginning of time to the Genesis account. And so that's how that came to be written. That's what they say happened. We don't, of course, do that at all. So now the steel, we mentioned earlier, the steel, the Babylon steel that was discovered and was pretty much unknown until recently, mentions Nebuchadnezzar building. And he was building a couple of ziggurats at the same time. Conservative scholars think that he was not actually building those, but he was restoring them. And I think that's most likely from what we know of history. We believe that he was restoring the ancient Tower of Babel as well as another, and that could have been very likely what was being done at Babalu, which was the Tower of Babel. I want to close tonight. At the end of that article, he was discussing things like linguistics, and I want to look at some studies that are being going on right now on linguistics. There's nothing conclusive about this, but it certainly is more information that we go on to suggest the stories are more than just myth. There's an online article at creation.com. You can find that if you like. KJ Duursema, and traces questions concerning the origins of the languages, and that all languages, if evolution were correct, would share a common genetic beginning. They unfortunately do not, or fortunately maybe they do not. But if language began at the same time in the same place as evolution would suggest that it would, then all the languages would share a common genetic beginning. There are some 20 major language groups these days, language families. Several seem to be completely unrelated to any of the others that we can find. And that's compelling evidence for us to have a different source rather than evolution for the breaking down of the languages. The idea is that family languages share common beginnings, but not all languages share the same beginning. Suggested, and this is a quote from the story, it suggests a designer. In Babel, one of these groups was given a sophisticated and utterly consistent Proto-Indo-European language. Sadly, as people in a fallen world began to use this language, it slowly began to lose some of its consistency as grammatical mistakes became fashionable. And that would explain why you would have families of text families of languages rather, that descend from a single language. So as somebody at Babel received a Proto-Indo-European language, some others received like an Asiatic language or Latin-based language or whatever. And then over time, those families broke down by linguistic evolution from that original thought, that original pure language. Linguistics can't prove the story, but if we take an objective look at the facts that are at our disposal, we cannot but draw the conclusion that the Bible account has far more going for it than the alternatives, for which there is little, if any, evidence. We therefore wholeheartedly believe that the findings of historical and comparative linguistics have served indeed to affirm the Tower of Babel account recorded in Genesis 11 beyond reasonable doubt. As we see the languages as they have descended from a common set of languages, original parent languages, but not all one language, as we would have to insist upon for evolution. Especially, folks, that's our lesson for tonight on Tower of Babel, and this is the last of the ones that we're going to look at for the first 11 chapters of Genesis. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I've enjoyed bringing it to you, but if not, that's just history and the way it goes. So thank you for your time, and I'll end this lesson this time with an invitation. If you need to respond to the invitation in any way, if you need to be baptized, if we can help you in any way, let us know as we continue our lessons tonight. Let us know in the chat, or let us know through calling us, or whatever you can do to let us know. We'll do what we can to take care of your needs. Thank you.